My name is Derek Shaw. I'm a survivalist, a man with a deep passion for nature and the wilderness. There's something about stripping life down to its basics. No tents, no gadgets, just me, the earth, and what I can pull from it. Over the years, I've spent more nights than I can count under the stars, in forests and mountains where most wouldn't dare tread alone, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened a few months ago. I tried to push it out of my mind, tried to bury the memory in the same way I bury my fire pits, but the truth has a way of gnawing at you, like the wind rattling branches in the dead of night. I guess I'm finally ready to tell my story. The story of the most horrific camping encounter of my life. It was in Algonquin, a place I thought I knew well, a place I loved. Now, I'll never look at it the same again. The air was cold enough to sting my lungs with each breath, and the snow crunched under my boots as I trudged deeper into the forest. I had been to Algonquin countless times, but never here, never this deep into untouched wilderness. That was the thrill of it, the unknown, a stretch of land where no trails led and no campers had likely ever set foot. I carried just enough gear to get by, a flint, a small hatchet, a few essentials, but the rest, as always, would come from the land. That's how I did things. The trees grew denser the further I went, their branches sagging under the weight of the snow. The landscape was quiet, almost too quiet, except for the occasional crack of a branch or the rustle of the wind whipping through the evergreens. It was that stillness, that isolation that made my heart race in a way that nothing else could. This part of the forest was new to me, untouched and wild. I could feel the excitement building as I scanned the terrain for a suitable campsite. After an hour or so of hiking, I found it, a small clearing nestled between two towering spruces, their branches arching from above to form a natural canopy. The ground was blanketed in snow, but beneath it, I could make out a rise in the land, an ideal spot for shelter. I dropped my pack and stretched, surveying the space. It was perfect, untouched by human hands. The idea of being the first to camp here, to explore these woods, sent a rush of energy through me. I could already picture the fire crackling in the center of the clearing, my shelter set up against the wind. This would be home, at least for the next few nights. Once the fire was going, the warmth of the flames began to melt the cold that had settled deep in my bones. The light flickered against the snowy backdrop, casting shadows that danced along the tree line. I took a deep breath, savoring the stillness for a moment before going back to work on the shelter. I gathered branches from the nearby trees, testing each one for strength before laying them out in a rough framework. A simple lean-to would do for the night. I layered the branches with smaller brush to insulate against the wind, which had started to pick up. My movements were automatic. This was routine for me by now, but as I worked, something began to feel off. It was subtle at first, just a faint tug at the back of my mind, a strange sense that something was different. I paused for a moment, listening, but all I heard was the crackle of the fire and the occasional whisper of wind through the trees. I shook it off and kept working, telling myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the place, the excitement of discovering new territory. But the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it grew stronger with each passing minute. I stood up straight, wiping the sweat from my brow despite the cold, and glanced around the clearing. My eyes scanned the tree line, searching for movement, anything out of the ordinary. But there was nothing, just the quiet, snow-covered woods. And yet, the sensation crept up my spine, like a cold hand pressing against the back of my neck. It was irrational, I told myself. I was alone out here. I had to be. But there was something about the way the trees stood, the way the shadows seemed to shift just beyond the fire's reach. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. I'd felt this way before, back in my early days of camping. That unsettling sense of being watched, always lurking just beneath the surface, gnawing at my nerves. I used to chalk it up to my imagination, the natural paranoia of being alone in the wilderness, but no matter how much I tried to convince myself, that feeling never fully went away. After getting my camp set up, I decided to head out and forage. I had packed some emergency rations, but I always preferred living off the land. Mushrooms, berries, the occasional fish if I got lucky. It was part of the challenge, part of why I loved survivalist camping. As the fire flickered behind me, I grabbed my small foraging sack and made my way into the trees, the snow crunching softly beneath my boots. It wasn't long before I found signs of life, a set of tracks leading off deeper into the forest. At first I thought they were deer tracks. The pattern was familiar, but as I looked closer, something wasn't quite right. The prints were spaced strangely, almost like they had been made by something walking on 2 legs rather than 4. I crouched down, examining them more closely. Bipedal, but still shaped like hooves. A chill ran down my spine. I told myself I was silly, that there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. Deer occasionally stand on their hind legs, especially when startled or trying to reach higher branches. It was rare, but not impossible. Still, something about these tracks felt off, unnatural. That's when the thought crept into my mind, the legend of the Wendigo. I had heard the stories before, whispered around campfires late at night, a monstrous creature that roamed the forest, once human but transformed by a hunger that could never be satisfied. I shook my head, pushing the thought aside. It was ridiculous, I told myself. Just a story, a legend meant to spook children. Still, staring at those tracks, I couldn't help but feel the cold fingers of dread tightening around me. I decided to head back to camp, my mind still buzzing with the thought of those strange tracks. On my way, I came across a fallen log, and there, clustered near its base, I found a patch of velvet foot mushrooms, small brown-capped fungi that thrive even in cold weather. I recognized them immediately. They were edible, and their resilience in these conditions always amazed me. Not much, but enough to complement the winter berries I'd gathered earlier. I carefully plucked a few of the mushrooms and made my way back to camp, relieved to have found something familiar. Once there, I tossed a few more branches onto the fire, stoking the flames back to life. The crackle and warmth steadied me as I prepared a simple meal, grateful that the wilderness could still provide, even in the dead of winter. After eating, I settled into my shelter, letting the fire's warmth wrap around me as I lay back. The quiet of the forest was soothing, and the flicker of the flames lulled me into a sense of calm. Before long, I drifted off to sleep. But sometime deep into the night, something stirred me awake. At first, I thought it was the wind, but there was a rhythm to the noise, a deliberate crunching sound, something moving slowly just outside the camp. My heart raced as I strained to listen, my breath freezing in the cold air. It wasn't the wind. Something was creeping around the perimeter of my camp, each step slow, calculated. Whatever it was close. I gripped my hunting knife tightly, my fingers tense around the handle as I listened. Whatever it was, it sounded large, but the steps were small, deliberate. It wasn't a bear. I'd encountered bears in the wild before, and they made much more noise, especially when trudging through the snow. No, this was something else. Something quieter, more cautious. As I strained my ears, trying to make sense of the sounds, a strange foul odor drifted through the air. It was faint at first, but quickly grew stronger. It smelled of decay, like something rotting, foul and unnatural. My stomach turned, and I felt a chill creep over me that had nothing to do with the cold. The fire was dying, its light fading fast. I couldn't let it go out, not with something creeping around out there. Slowly, I reached over and grabbed a few pieces of wood, throwing them onto the embers. Sparks flew up, and the fire flickered back to life, casting long, dancing shadows around the trees. I sat up, listening intently, knife in hand, trying to locate the source of the smell and sounds. But as the wind picked up, the noises began to fade. It was as if whatever had been circling the camp was walking away, its footsteps growing softer and softer until they disappeared completely into the night. For a long time, I just sat there, my senses on high alert, waiting for the sound to return. But all I heard was the wind rustling through the trees. After what felt like an eternity of silence, I finally let myself relax a little, convincing myself that whatever had been there was gone. The rest of the night passed without incident, and despite the unease gnawing at the back of my mind, I eventually drifted off again. The forest remained quiet, almost peaceful, but that lingering sense of something watching me never truly left. The next morning, with the sun shining through the trees and the fire reduced to glowing embers, the events of the previous night felt distant, like a half-remembered dream. The unsettling sounds, the strange smell, all of it seemed like the product of an overactive mind, stirred up by the isolation. I packed what little I had to use and set off to forage again, my focus shifting back to the task at hand. The forest was calm, and the cold air felt refreshing. But as I wandered further from camp, the creeping sense of unease returned. It wasn't anything immediate, no sounds, no movement, just a feeling gnawing at the edge of my awareness. Then I saw them, tracks in the snow. My breath caught in my throat as I crouched down to get a better look. The same hoofed tracks from yesterday, the same strange pattern, as though whatever left them was walking on two legs. And they were close, too close. My camp wasn't more than 100 yards away, and these tracks, they circled it. I stood up, trying to shake off the rising dread. This didn't make sense. I had been sure it was just a deer or some animal, but seeing those tracks again, so close to where I had slept, it was unsettling. My mind raced with possibilities, but I forced myself to stay calm, to keep moving. There was a logical explanation. There had to be. Then, a sharp crack pierced the stillness of the forest, a sound so loud it seemed to echo off the trees. It wasn't the rustling of the wind or the snap of a small twig. It was deliberate, heavy, like a large branch snapping under the weight of something. I whipped around, my eyes scanning the dense forest where the sound had come from. For a moment, I thought I saw something. A large hulking figure just at the edge of the trees, blending into the shadows. My heart pounded in my chest as I squinted, trying to make out any details. But after a few agonizing moments of silence, the figure was gone. Or maybe it had never been there at all. I stood frozen, the tension building in my chest as my mind fought off to rationalize what I had seen, or thought I had seen. It had to be my imagination, the shadows playing tricks on me. I hadn't slept well, and the isolation was getting to me. That's all it was. I returned to camp, the strange feeling still clinging to me like a second skin. My mind kept drifting back to those tracks, the heavy snap in the distance, and that brief glimpse of something, if it had been anything at all. I shook it off and focused on gathering wood, deciding to collect more than I needed this time. If nothing else, I wanted the fire to burn strong through the night. As the day dragged on, the sense of being watched never left me. It was subtle, like an itch I couldn't scratch, but always there, keeping me on edge. I tried to focus on my tasks, checking the perimeter, stoking the fire, but the unease gnawed at me. When the sun began to sink below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees, I could feel the tension rising again. Night fell quickly, and soon it was time to settle in. The wind had died down, leaving the forest eerily still. The fire crackled in front of me, the soft glow offering some comfort against the darkness pressing in from all sides. I lay down, pulling my sleeping bag tight around me, trying to relax. The fire was strong, the camp was secure, everything would be fine. But then, deep into the night, I was jolted awake. A sound. No, a scream. It wasn't close, but it was loud enough to cut through the silence like a blade. A screeching wail, distant but piercing. The kind of sound that does not belong in the natural world. My heart leapt into my throat, and goosebumps rippled up my arms and neck. I sat up, the knife back in my hand before I realized it. Every muscle in my body was tense, my ears straining to hear anything else. I had heard animals cry out in the night before, wolves, coyotes, even owls, but this was different. It was a raw, primal sound, full of something I couldn't place. Fear, anger, pain. I didn't know, but whatever had made it, I knew one thing for sure. I had never heard anything like it before. It was then that the realization hit me, hard and cold. I was no longer safe. The creature, whatever it was out there, and it was real. The tracks, the strange figure in the shadows, the eerie scream in the night. It had been watching me the whole time, waiting. I didn't know how long it had been lurking, but now, after that scream, I knew one thing for certain. I was not alone out here. My mind raced, trying to piece together what to do next. My truck was about 5 miles away, parked near the edge of the trailhead where I had started. 5 miles through dense, dark forest, with that thing, whatever it was, out there, stalking me. The thought of escaping, of getting out of these woods gnawed at me. It was the only thing that made sense, the only chance I had. But then, just as I started to gather my thoughts, I heard it. Footsteps. Soft at first, distant but unmistakable. They were slow, deliberate, as if whatever was out there wanted me to hear it coming. My pulse quickened, and my grip on the knife tightened. The sound was getting closer, each step crunching in the snow, growing louder with each second. I sat frozen, staring out into the darkness beyond the glow of the fire, but I couldn't see anything. The flames flickered weakly now, casting shadows that danced against the trees. It was close, closer than it had been last night. My breath hitched as I tried to steady myself, but the pounding in my chest drowned out every rational thought. I was not ready for this. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get out of the camp and head for the truck, but my legs wouldn't move. Fear rooted me to the spot, and all I could do was listen as the footsteps grew nearer, the air thick with the smell of decay once again. I had to make a decision, stay and face whatever was out there, or make a break for it into the unknown darkness. Either way, the creature knew where I was. I had to run. There was no time to think. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't going to stay out there circling my camp forever. I needed to get to my truck, back to the safety of civilization. The thought of fleeing surged through me like a bolt of adrenaline, but I knew I had to be smart about it. Quiet. I didn't want to alert the creature until I had a head start. I moved quickly, my hands shaking as I tried to pack up my gear. My mind raced, trying to figure out the best route back. The forest was a maze in the dark, but the path wasn't entirely invisible. The snow, coupled with the bright moonlight, reflected enough that I could see through the trees, even if only barely. It was dangerous, but at this point, it didn't matter. I'd rather be lost out there than trapped with whatever was stalking me. I grabbed my bag and slung it over my shoulder, keeping my knife gripped tightly in my hand. The weight of the blade was reassuring, even though I wasn't sure it would do me any good. With one last glance at the dying fire, I stepped away from the camp, moving quickly, but as quietly as I could. As soon as I was out of the small clearing, the sound returned. The footsteps. They were behind me again, deliberate and slow, like the thing was pacing itself just enough to keep up but not enough to attack. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound of it so loud in my ears that it drowned out everything else. I couldn't hear the wind or the crackle of snow under my boots, just my own heartbeat, thundering in my ears like a drum. I walked faster, trying not to break into a full run. Running would make too much noise. I needed to stay calm, but every fiber of my being was screaming at me to sprint, to flee into the darkness as fast as I could. I could feel it, just beyond the trees, watching, waiting. The footsteps were growing louder, keeping pace with me, as if it knew I was trying to escape. I clutched the knife tighter, my knuckles turning white. I had no idea how far I'd gone, or if I was even heading in the right direction. After what felt like an eternity of weaving through the dark forest, the trees finally began to thin out, and suddenly I stumbled onto the familiar main trail. Relief washed over me for a moment. This was the path that would take me back to my truck. I knew I had to head left, just a few miles to go, and I'd be safe. My lungs burned from the cold and the tension, but I forced myself to keep moving, my heart still racing in my chest. Then, it happened. A scream, louder and more terrifying than the one I had heard earlier, shattered the silence. It wasn't just a sound. It was a visceral, blood-chilling wail that echoed through the trees, reverberating inside my skull. My entire body tensed, and without thinking, I spun around, knife in hand, my eyes scanning the forest behind me. That's when I saw it. Standing in the shadows just beyond the tree line, illuminated faintly by the moonlight filtering through the canopy, was the creature, tall, emaciated, its skin clinging tightly to its bones, pale as death itself. Its eyes, glowing with a sickly, unnatural light, locked onto me. The creature was skeletal, its body unnaturally thin, and its mouth stretched into a horrific grin, showing rows of jagged teeth. But what struck me the most were the horns, massive, twisted antlers protruding from its head, casting long shadows over its sunken, hollow face. The Wendigo. It was real. It wasn't just some legend, some old story to scare people around the campfire. It was here, and it was hunting me. My blood ran cold, and for a moment I was frozen in place, paralyzed by the sheer terror of what I was seeing. The creature didn't move, but I could feel its hunger, its malice, radiating from it. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it might burst. This thing, this nightmare made flesh, wasn't going to let me leave the forest. I didn't wait for it to move. I bolted. My legs carried me faster than I thought possible, down the trail, toward my truck, toward safety. But no matter how fast I ran, I could still hear it behind me, the soft, methodical footsteps and the echo of that terrible scream. The Wendigo was coming. The forest blurred around me as I sprinted, my lungs burning with every breath, my legs pumping with a desperation I hadn't known I was capable of. Behind me, the Wendigo was closing in, its footsteps growing louder, faster, more aggressive. I could hear its labored breathing, feel its presence bearing down on me. I was running as fast as I could, but it wasn't enough. It was gaining on me. My heart pounded harder than ever, fear coursing through my veins like fire. I could see the moonlight ahead, the trail narrowing as it bent through the trees. My truck was still too far, but I had no choice. I had to keep going. Every second counted. Then I heard it, right behind me, too close. In a moment of pure survival instinct, I spun around, knife in hand, and lunged at the creature. I drove the blade deep into its chest, the point sinking into its pale skeletal flesh. The Wendigo let out a high-pitched wail of pain, its eyes glowing brighter as it screeched, but my attack barely slowed it down. With one powerful swipe of its long, emaciated arm, it knocked me clean off my feet, and I flew through the air, my body tumbling uncontrollably. It felt like I was airborne forever, crashing through the snow and leaves before skidding to a painful stop. I must have flown at least 30 feet. The wind completely knocked out of me. Dazed, I struggled to move, gasping for air, my chest heaving as I tried to regain control. I looked up, my knife still embedded in the creature's chest, but it barely seemed to notice. It stood there, its grotesque form towering over the snow, blood oozing slowly from the wound as it locked its cold, glowing eyes on me. It began walking toward me, slow and deliberate, like a predator toying with its prey. The way it moved was horrifying, its steps almost unnatural, its hunger palpable. I tried to push myself up, but before I could, the creature let out another deafening roar. The sound tore through the night, a high-pitched screech that pierced my ears and rattled my brain. It was unbearable. The sheer volume of it sent me onto my knees. My hands clamped over my ears as I cried out in pain, trying to block it out. My head throbbed, my vision blurred, and the world spun around me. I could feel the Wendigo's rage, its hatred in that scream, and it was driving me to the brink of madness. I was helpless, vulnerable, and the Wendigo was closing in. As I knelt there, ears ringing from that creature's horrific screech, a thought broke through the haze of pain. My flare gun. I had always packed it for emergencies, a last resort. This was beyond any emergency I had ever imagined. The Wendigo was closing in, its twisted form looming over me, ready to strike again. Desperately, I scrambled for my bag, fingers shaking as I fumbled with the zipper. The creature's footsteps were heavy, growing closer with each agonizing second. Finally, I grabbed hold of the flare gun, yanking it free. My heart raced as I cocked the hammer back, my vision still swimming as I raised the flare gun with trembling hands. The Wendigo's glowing eyes locked onto mine. I could feel its malice, its hunger bearing down on me. Without hesitation, I pulled the trigger. The flare shot out with a blinding flash, filling the night with a brilliant red-orange glow. The world around me lit up in an instant. Every tree, every snow-covered branch illuminated in the harsh, fiery light. The flare struck the creature square in the chest, embedding itself next to my knife. For a split second, the Wendigo stood frozen, its skeletal form outlined in the intense light. Then, it screeched again, an ear-piercing guttural wail that shook the very ground beneath me. The flare burned fiercely, sending plumes of smoke curling up from its chest as the creature thrashed in agony. Its movements became frantic, wild as it staggered backward, clawing at the burning flare lodged in its chest. I watched, breathless, as the Wendigo turned and bolted into the forest, retreating into the dark wilderness from where it had come from. The fiery glow of the flare flickered through the trees as the creature vanished into the night, my knife still embedded in its chest. Its howls echoed in the distance, growing fainter and fainter, till finally, there was nothing. I collapsed to the ground, my body trembling with exhaustion and relief. The creature had retreated into the forest, but I couldn't waste a second. Pain shot through my body with every step as I forced myself to run. My lungs burned, and my ribs throbbed from the impact of the Wendigo's earlier strike, but the adrenaline kept me moving. The woods blurred around me as I sprinted toward my truck, each breath sharp and ragged in the freezing air. I burst out onto the trail, barely keeping my footing on the icy ground. My truck was just ahead, its shape almost surreal in the moonlight. I stepped toward it, wrenching the door open and collapsing into the driver's seat. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for the keys, and when I turned the ignition, the engine sputtered and groaned, refusing to catch. Come on, I muttered, panic rising in my chest. My heart pounded in my ears as I glanced frantically at the surrounding forest, half expecting the Wendigo to burst out from the trees at any second. Finally, with a rough cough, the engine roared to life. I slammed the truck into drive, but as I pressed the gas, I heard something, the same sickening screech from before. I whipped my head around and my blood ran cold. The Wendigo was right outside my truck. Before I could react, its bony hand smashed through the glass, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. The freezing night air rushed in as its claws raked across my face. The pain was immediate and excruciating, a burning sting that cut deep into my skin. It was like its touch carried fire, searing my flesh. I screamed in agonizing pain. For a moment, I thought it had me, its long fingers digging into my flesh, but I hit the gas, the tires spinning in the snow before catching. The truck lurched forward, and I felt the Wendigo's grip slip as it tumbled away from the window, screeching as I sped down the icy road. The cold air howled through the broken window, biting into my skin like needles, but I kept my foot down on the accelerator. My breath came out in desperate, ragged gasps, my face throbbing from the Wendigo's attack. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw it, a tall, dark silhouette. Its glowing eyes locked onto me as it gave chase, its form unnatural and terrifying in the moonlight. It was fast, too fast, but as I pushed the truck harder, I could see the distance between us grow. Slowly, inch by inch, the Wendigo faded into the dark, its silhouette disappearing into the snowy wilderness. But I didn't slow down, not until I knew I was miles away. For weeks after that night, sleep had been elusive. Even when exhaustion finally pulled me under, the nightmares always dragged me back into the cold, haunted wilderness. My ribs, fractured from the creature's vicious strike, ached constantly. I hadn't even realized how badly I'd been hurt until I made it home. The adrenaline, the need to survive, it had all numbed the pain until I collapsed in my driveway. Now, my body bore the scars of that encounter. 3 long, jagged lines across my face, a permanent reminder of the Wendigo's claws. Every time I looked in the mirror, I was forced to relive that night, the night I came face to face with a legend. People asked about the scars, and I always gave them the same answer, a bear attack. It was easier that way, easier than trying to explain what had really happened. Who would believe me? Tonight, though, the warmth of my home did little to soothe my nerves. Even surrounded by safety, I couldn't shake the lingering dread. It clung to me, a constant shadow, always waiting. Then, it came. A sound in the dead of night, cutting through the silence with chilling clarity. A loud screeching wail, unnatural, piercing. I shot up in bed, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was distant, but unmistakable. It was the same wail that had shattered the night in Algonquin. My heart raced as I sat there, listening. The creature, whatever it was, it had found me. The Wendigo was still out there.